I'm Shar Banerjee, and this is Books That Built Me. I'm an ex-executive turned to leadership coach specializing in people managers. My job is to get people out of that manager headspace and into their leadership growth space. Typically, I work with clients to build their leadership DNA and self-leadership muscles in group programs or one-to-one coaching. But on this show, we dive deep into the stories of other leaders. And it all starts with a book that they believe has influenced their decisions, and these book lessons are now life lessons. Welcome to Books That Built Me. Today, we're in conversation with Sonya Stattmann, and in today's episode, we're going to be discussing the book No Bad Parts by Richard Schwartz. In a world often plagued by self-doubt and inner turmoil, this book, The No Bad Parts, shines a beacon of hope. It reminds us that beneath our layers of pain, insecurity, and all of that other stuff, there exists a core of innate goodness and resilience. At its essence, No Bad Parts advocates for a holistic approach to healing, one that honors all aspects of yourself, even the ones that we don't perceive as positive or worthy. So by embracing the concept of this internal family systems, Schwartz empowers everybody to cultivate compassion for every part of themselves, leading to profound personal transformation. Richard Schwartz is not just an author, but he is a pioneer in the field of psychotherapy. He's a founder of the internal family systems model, and this is an effective approach in treating a wide range of psychological issues. He developed the internal family systems model while working with clients who suffered from trauma, and he was inspired by his observations on how individuals displayed different quote-unquote parts of themselves in therapy sessions, and he formulated the concept that our psyche consists of various subpersonalities or parts that interact with us daily. I'm so glad you could join us for this conversation with Sonya. It's going to be a good one. Here we go. Welcome, Sonya. This is Sonya Stattmann. I would love for you to introduce yourself.
Okay, awesome. Hi, everyone. I'm Sonya Stattmann. I've basically been a coach and a speaker for the last 24 years, and I've really focused on helping people reduce stress, improve their mental health, and build resilience. So I do that with individuals, teams, and organizations, which I really love. And I guess you could say my mission is really to, help people expand their capacity for handling stress, change, and adversity. And that's really kind of the definition of building resilience. But I find that, I feel like that's the core solution for almost everything we're facing in the world right now.
Wow, that's awesome. And I think that this lends itself so beautifully to the book that we're going to discuss. But before we get into the book that we're about to discuss, I think everyone needs to know that there was another book that was your number one that I couldn't find in time because it's an oldie. So let's just do a quick shout out to that book for anyone who's interested in knowing what your true number one was.
Okay, great. Yeah. So it's called I Sit Listening to the Wind. And it's like a book from the 90s, and it's, really interesting. But I think what's so powerful about that book is it's about women navigating their internal masculine. And that's just a really interesting topic to explore. I've taught it to many, many groups of women and just watched some profound realizations and transformations happen with it. It's a very simple book, but yeah, it's hard to access. It's hard to find. I wish that I had bought out hundreds of them and I would just pass them out to everyone.
Yeah, it was hard to get a Amazon 1 day, 2 day delivery. It was like a 3-week wait before I could get my hands on it. And that I didn't have enough time for our recording. So unfortunately that couldn't work. But I am so intrigued by that even notion that there is a masculine within a feminine. Mm-hmm. It makes sense, actually, as I say it out loud in my lived experience. I think that that's very true. Even when you think of yin and yang, darkness and light, it's very similar in the vibes of there's an element that's different than the lightness in the other part. And I do agree. I think men and women occupy both spaces. But I think if we do it with intention and focus, what does that result in, especially for women who maybe tend to stay away from hugging their masculine parts?
Yeah. And I think it really reflects how we've internalize some of the toxic masculine as well. And, we've really kind of brought that in. We don't necessarily have a good relationship with our masculine. And so this kind of unwinds what it would look like to have a very healthy relationship with the internal masculine. And I just think that's really powerful.
Okay, well, maybe we'll have to have you back again for that book, because this just sounds, even this little teaser trailer sounds so interesting. But let's get into No Bad Parts, because No Bad Parts is the book of your choice. And before we dive in, I think the title itself gives away, I think, what the essence of the book is, but overall, very intriguing sounding title. How do you interpret it to what it means and how it reflects, the essence of what the bottom line of this book is?
Yeah, well, I think the bottom line and the most important thing in this book is an idea I feel like I've always had and always resonated. So when I read this book, I feel like, oh, this is just affirming what I've always felt, which is that all humans are inherently good. There's no bad parts of us. There is no wrong, evil, bad parts of us. There's just parts that are trying to survive. There's parts that are trying to, make sure they're still breathing, right? Make sure that we're succeeding, whatever that looks like. And so, to me is the core essence of this, is there are no bad parts. We don't need to pathologize what we experience, and we are all inherently good.
Oh, I love that. We are all inherently good. And I love that you said that this was a feeling that you've had for a very, very long time, because I will echo the same thing. I think the foundational truth in my core is that everybody is good.
Yes.
Everybody inherently is good. There are versions of us that don't act in that way, and that's could be a temporary blip. There's also versions of us that see in others a story that's not in keeping with that foundational truth. But if you held that foundational truth to be true at all times, I think it changes the way that you show up, for in a relationship, for yourself, what have you. But yeah, I love that. I love that this was an idea of yours that you always had, and then this book kind of like validated it, right?
Yeah, it's great to have your beliefs validated.
It kind of is nice for someone to say, yeah, you're right. You were right.
You're right all along.
Okay, well, let's dive deeper, because I know this book is a experiential one, right? Like there's so many meaty parts to it. Let's get into the parts that really resonate with you, because I kind of want to get into elements of this book, maybe insights that are specific, that have triggered some sort of shift in either your perspective or your understanding, and just the overall impact that it's had in your life.
Yeah, awesome. So just dive in.
Let's do it. Let's do it.
I think that piece of goodness is really, like I said, a core piece, and, understanding that all humans are really good, and that we don't need to make their parts bad. They don't need to make, their own parts bad. And this is what I really found. I mean, I've had the opportunity, because I've been in business for 24 years, to work with thousands of people. And always, every time, each person I've worked with, there is this inherent goodness. There's this inherent self. And that's one of the kind of core concepts of this book as well, is that underneath all the parts, there's kind of this self, right? And I have absolutely seen it. And, before I had this book, he calls it the self, but I always called it the essential self. It's like, all of who we are, the core of who we are is actually unchanging. And that is the self, or the essential self. And I think that part is just really interesting. And I've unpacked that a lot with clients, with myself, with my family, like over years and years and years. And what I found is that essential self has impulses, right? So oftentimes what we call like our life purpose, to me, that's the self's impulses. And so, we've got this like core part of us. And if we can touch that, if we can get to know that, if we can find that, if we can live in that, then we experience a lot more joy and aliveness, a lot more connection to others, a lot more self-compassion and empathy for others. And I think that's kind of like the core purpose, is for us to kind of get in touch with that self. And he really, I think, easily and very elegantly describes what that looks like.
And just for anyone who has not read this book, and this is a new topic for them, is the idea that the parts cover up that self, the true essence of yourself.
Yeah, I mean, and I think it actually would be helpful to kind of talk about like what is sort of the basis. I mean, obviously, like this is a book written by Dr. Schwartz, and he is the creator of a therapy and coaching model called internal family systems. And so this is a model that has been well practiced, well established. He personally has worked with I don't even know how many people on it, and he's trained people, and so this is a very kind of established model. And the idea is that inside of everyone, we all have parts. So we have multiples, he calls it, or we have, in these sort of individualized parts. And everyone has them. You can call them maybe sub-minds. They're operating unconsciously and they get stuck in past experience, but they keep operating as if they're still living in those experiences.
Patterns.
So,
yeah.
yes. And each of these parts really plays out roles. They carry burdens and they operate our lives and we don't really understand it. And so it's very interesting when you start to kind of unpack that, because it's like we've got these little clusters of parts. They're all kind of doing the job they think they're supposed to do.
Yeah.
And when you unravel it through like internal family systems, or this book has a lot of good exercises in it too.
Yes.
You start to recognize that, oh, okay, so these parts are all kind of playing off of each other. But inside, I can connect with the self that can kind of manage all of them, lead all of them, support all of them. And some of those parts just integrate and, or develop new roles, which is one of the things that happens.
Yeah, they evolve, right? They actually evolve. Can we get a bit more experiential with these parts? Like, what are some examples of the types of parts that are within humans?
Okay, well, I think let's start with talking about roles, and then we can talk about how those roles might manifest, right? So he breaks it down into this idea that there are different roles that these parts take. And so the self is its own separate role, and it's something that we can't observe. Like, so if you're observing something, it's not the self, right? The self is not, you can be it, you can sit in it, but you can't really like observe it in the same way that you can a part.
Right.
The other roles, they're kind of divided into three that he specifically talks about. One is exiles. And so this is kind of like our younger, more sensitive, kind of inner children. And they're really open when we're young. And they're usually exiled because they experience some very deep wound. And so this part of us is chronically wounded. And they often are like the parts of us that feel really unworthy, are very isolated, or maybe there's like intense fear.
Right.
And so,
And
that's
it's like locked in that memory of an early childhood space where some form of trauma feels like the right word to use. Yeah. Trauma lived here and you're stuck in that experience and it's locked in because you were a kid when that happened.
Correct.
Okay.
And it can be like a big trauma, because I know a lot of people think about trauma as like these big events.
Horrible things that happen to you. Yeah.
Or it can be a bunch of small traumas.
Right.
So for instance, even like bullying, even though we justify and say that wasn't a big deal when we were young, over time that becomes a trauma, right? So small T's, they call them like big T's and small T's.
Small T trauma and big T trauma. Yeah, it's real.
Yeah, it's very real. And these exiles, kind of like form, they have some of the same beliefs and emotions that were kind of during that time, but we often stuff them away or exile them because we feel ashamed or they aren't strong enough or, we needed to be tough. And that's when another role comes in. And so, our other roles are protectors. And there's really kind of two kinds, managers and firefighters. And so managers are really focused on preventing the same experiences from happening again.
Right.
So they are the hypervigilant. They are the organized. They are these parts of us that put everything in a row and make sure everything's, fixed and taken care of so that nothing bad happens. That's a manager role.
Yeah.
Yeah. And then the firefighters, they come in like when we're already triggered. So they just like, they do whatever is necessary to protect the exile or to protect a part of ourselves. And they're desperate and they have little regard for collateral damage. So, they're the kind of things that come out screaming, come out yelling, create lots of destruction in an effort to survive. And so, those are kind of the firefighters. So those are kind of the three roles that these parts play out. And then, there's just like infinite ways that happens.
That's awesome. And I so identify as the manager as you were speaking. I'm like, that's me.
Yeah. I mean, most of us have a lot of manager parts, right?
Yeah.
Like, because we have had all these experiences and now we're smart. We make sure we're hyper vigilant. We take care of everything.
Totally.
And, and that's good. Like, and that's the thing about these parts is that they all have a really powerful role to play. They all have developed skills that help us in life. But when they're trying to manage a wound or manage an exile or manage all these other parts, it's like a lot of extra energy that they could be applying to something more productive.
Right. It's like this waste of energy because it doesn't need to do the work that it's doing because it thinks that it's protecting for good, or it thinks that it's managing or, doing the work that it needs to because it's called on. But your point is actually that's not true. Like that is maybe a pattern that you're playing out and it's habits and some neuro wiring that's just, happening on its own without our, I guess, monitoring. It just kind of is happening in the back end.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. So I think it's really helpful to start to look at these things because, I always look for threads when I'm working with someone or even in myself, right? I kind of pull these threads and he calls it trailheads, being able to kind of, touch the trailhead and then you just sort of follow it down, see where it goes.
Yeah.
And I like to pull threads.
Yeah.
And so, you can kind of see a lot of the ways we don't like parts of ourselves, or we judge parts of ourselves, that's usually a great trailhead or a great thread to pull, right?
Right.
And so you can start with something like you think when you sabotage yourself, or maybe, you constantly feel like you're lazy, right? So, wherever kind of you have those self-judgments, those are really great places to start to explore. Because the part of ourselves that, he calls the self has no judgment, has complete compassion. That's how you actually know you're finally sitting in that seat of the self, is there's like complete compassion for every part of you. So when you don't have complete compassion for something, that's a great place to kind of explore in terms of like, what role is this? What part is this that has judgment?
I'm not sure if this was in the book specifically or if it came out in my research of internal family systems, because again, so much to read about that.
Oh, yeah.
So interesting, so fascinating. But there is this one exercise that you can do to get to know your parts a little bit better. If maybe you can elaborate a little bit further on this, but there's this exercise that you can do within yourself to have yourself give the voice, like give the microphone to a certain part of you, and they get to speak how they want, communicate whatever they want to say, like really have the floor. Nobody's interrupting them. There's no judgment, and they just get to be and exist. And you get to do that for multiple parts of you. So let's say 2 parts. And, the self of you is watching. And I love how you put that so beautifully, because the self of you does not judge, has super compassion for everything and everybody, is calm and relaxed and not stressed. And so in that exercise, as I'm thinking about it, of course that's happening because it's the self that's watching these parts play out, and the parts get to be dramatic and assertive and all of these things fully, they're not, there's not just like a tiny version that kind of shows it, like fully, full out. And then the ultimate exercise is for you to reconcile the parts and to understand their perspectives.
Yeah,
So
exactly.
interesting.
It's really interesting. And there's a lot of those in the books. And some people find it helpful to do the audio version and then to listen to the exercise and then write about it and explore it. And look, it can get complicated in there, right? Like these roles have like really
It's weird. It's weird, right? Like this is not something you're doing on your lunch break, right? Like it takes, you have to be in a certain space and a head space to do this kind of work. It's
Yeah.
hard.
It is. It can be. But even just like the basics, like even understanding this is really powerful because even like say, let's say you're sitting in the boardroom, you can't go out and process your
Right.
parts, right? While you're
Right.
sitting in there. But you can all of a sudden notice that you have this part that's trying to dominate or you have this part that's hiding, right? And so even understanding that, even being able to recognize that helps you separate from the part, and that part has less control. And so, there is a lot of benefit just to understanding this because you start to recognize, and of course, the more you experience it, the more you work with it, the more understanding you have in the moment of like, ooh, that's an interesting part that just showed up, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
And we're able to have more compassion for it. And sometimes the parts kind of melt, right? Like they kind of dissolve in that moment. And we have more self-leadership in that moment.
Yeah, like they're not defined as there's a border around them. They just kind of become, they squish in together. And I love how you said the thing about self-leadership. Yeah, say more words about what that translates to.
Yeah, well, I think when we're sitting in the self, right? I mean, the whole idea of this, exploration is that the self can hold the leadership of all the parts, right? Because it doesn't blend with the parts. It doesn't get involved in the drama of the parts. It's just holding this compassionate space. And so when we allow the self to lead, and this is something I think is also really interesting that he talks about in the book, is that sometimes we think of the self as like the witness or the observer, but that's not actually the self. The self wants action. It wants to be, in connection and in relationship with the parts. It's just infinitely compassionate. And so imagine a self leading the parts. And, a lot of these parts, have been even like the protectors. They were developed when we were like 9 or 6 or 5. They think that we are still a child and they are children in when they were developed. So they're not great at self-leadership, right? Not in the way we would hope leadership to be.
Yeah.
And so when the self can come in and be this mature adult self saying that, hey, I can hold space for all of you. We can work this out. We can unravel these things. It's really powerful, and we're able to step in to, a really powerful leadership space in what we're doing in sort of any situation. And I don't think we ever get to a place where like all our parts are good, like, where there's like no parts acting out. I mean, I still am constantly dissolving and uncovering and exploring parts. So it's really interesting.
Yeah, and even the whole thing about figuring out the parts that, the self is like there's no judgment there. There can be a part that you just were burying and, like now it's more obvious to you.
Yeah.
As you're saying all of the things about the self and the self-leadership and managing all of our parts, I can't help but wonder, in the internal family systems model, is all of the work self-directed, or is there a version where you're actually in relationship with another, where this parts work is meaningful and impactful? Because, a lot of the things that we're talking about right now, if you had a coach that you're working with, if you had a safe space, a psychologically safe space, you can sort of like parse all of this out. And as you said, it takes years, right? It's like a lifelong journey, figuring who you are. The discovery of who you are is a lifelong process. And so that's the self work. But what's the next, right? Like in relationship to others, in teams, or families, what's the model like for outside of you?
Yeah, I think on some level, I think it's all still self work, right? But I think we can work with others by understanding, if sort of two parties or a team or whatever is willing to play with this idea, right? Willing to kind of play with these parts. It is really helpful. Like I find we do that in my husband and me. He's also read No Bad Parts. I mean, I've studied a lot more, obviously, but he's read it. He has the concepts. He understands it. So sometimes we'll talk about that. I'll be like, that's an interesting part coming to play right now. Or here is the part for me that's up right now.
Yeah.
And I definitely discuss it with friends of mine who are also very familiar with this. So we'll kind of talk about the different parts playing out, or we'll help each other unpack parts.
Yeah.
And so I think that's something that definitely can be explored and done. And I do think there's a lot of people that are starting to play with this in teams and organizations, right? Being able to go in and kind of introduce these concepts, help people to kind of play with them. And it can be really fun. Like being able to act out a part is really fun, right? And it's not a joke. And he also kind of covers that in the book. Like these parts are very serious, and they really are entangled in whatever they're experiencing. But giving yourself permission to feel it, to say what it needs to say, that's very empowering.
Yeah. And to be playful with it too. I think that's the other thing that's not being said here. But I think being playful with your parts helps your parts feel safer to come out.
Definitely. And they're like kids. Most of them are kids, right?
Totally.
So, they need to play. And in fact, one of the things that is part of the process is as you're kind of unpacking these, you give them a voice, and then, eventually you ask them if they're ready to kind of lift their burdens, to leave their burdens behind, whatever they kind of developed as burdens when they were young. And then you ask them what role they want to play. I mean, a lot of my children want like a playroom. They want to go, to like a massive, so I create in my mind a massive playroom for them to play with video games and, and swings and toys and that's where they can live happily and in their child role that I feel like in my life I didn't really get to experience.
That's so funny. I was just at the playground yesterday, and there was this 4-year-old who said to me, not my kid, but another 4-year-old who said to me, "This is my home now." And I'm like, "No, you have a home. You're going to go home to your bed." She's like, "Why would I do that? There's the jungle gym over there. Here's the swing. I have my sand. There's another toy over there. Like this is everything that I need." And then another kid says to her, "Well, no, there are no toys here." And she's like, "Look at the sand. That's my toy." And I just thought to myself, wow, this is what kids want. They want the they want their imagination to just go wild and free. So I love that you're creating that for your brain. Because that's what's necessary and needed.
Yeah. And it's helpful. And you feel a release, right? You feel relief that that role is not having to play out all these things that it feels burdened by.
Yeah. Oh, this is so wonderful. Okay, what else? I know that we talked about very important, moments or specific insights from the book. The roles is a big one. Oops. You're good. The roles is a big one. Is there another insight that you want to touch on, Sonia?
Well, this is one really cool thing that surprised me.
Yes,
and I can't remember, to be honest. I've done some training with Dr. Schwartz, so I can't remember if it was in the training or in the book. But
That's fine.
This is one really interesting thing about this is that each part has like its own beliefs, emotions, personalities, and the part has access to anything it needs to survive. And this means including turning on genes, manifesting disease, and causing physical problems. This was like a whoosh to me. I was
say more words about this. This is so fascinating.
Yeah. And I've actually explored this with people as well. So it's like these physical manifestations are created by parts that are trying to survive. So let's say someone's having seizures, right?
Okay.
And not everyday seizures, but these random once in a while seizures.
Yeah.
And they seem to happen at specific times of heavy stress, times where they don't want to take responsibility, times where it's like, and so, it's an exploration, right? There's no like concrete evidence for this, but exploring that this part uses this physical manifestation to survive, to solve the problems that it's trying to solve is really interesting. And I have seen people who have a lot of insights from that.
So let's stick with that example of the ailment that was being observed. Mm-hmm. What was the part trying to do? And what was the story there? The relationship?
It was like it sort of created a lack of responsibility, right? So in other words, when this ailment comes on, it's so extreme that they completely can't do anything.
Yeah.
Right. And so whenever there's a fear about having to step into something or having to take responsibility for something or something being too hard to navigate, then it's like this physical manifestation would come on. And I mean, it's completely unconscious, right?
Wow.
It's not like we're deliberately saying, I'm going to have an
Yeah.
accident, right? It's just that these parts can turn on genes. And this is what Dr. Schwartz says. After all his study, he's realized they can literally manifest and kind of, physically change us only what it has access to, right? So all of us have sort of different gene keys
Of
that
course.
some are on, some are off. And I just thought that was really fascinating. And I actually watched him do a demo with a woman who had like stomach issues, like from the time she was a child.
Okay.
And it was like she had all this pain. She'd been to every kind of doctor, done all kinds of medicine, like nothing healed it.
Yeah.
And in the session, he basically unpacked the part that was like her 11-year-old self. And, it was like this thing where I think one of the members of her family had died. And so it was like this part had just associated, this feeling, this physical ailment with some of this like trauma. And it was just all locked back with these roles. And so it was just fascinating. And so then it minimized, like the pain went away during the process that he was working with her. And yeah, I mean, to me,
Wow.
that was just like, okay, wow. Okay. So,
And she was not planted.
no.
Because
Just
this is how my
volunteered.
brain works. I'm like, is that a plant?
No, just volunteered.
That's amazing. But you
Yeah.
know what? I believe it because the brain is so powerful. More than we can possibly even comprehend.
Yes.
That her pain went away, even talking about it is evidence of that. That there are synapses and neurons that are literally changing as we speak and process information through our bodies and our minds. It's wild.
Yeah.
Cool.
So much of what I teach is about our biology, right? Because our biology is so powerful. Our nervous system, our brain, like all the things that are unconscious that we don't control is like 100 times more powerful than our conscious brain. We give all this power to our thinking brain, but it is like nothing compared to what our body can do.
Yes.
And so, it's really interesting. And this
It's
just was
true.
kind of that confirmation and that understanding, but really a really different way to tackle like disease and physical ailments too.
Yeah, talk about self-sabotage, huh? Like that your DNA is like, well, I'll show you.
Yeah, it's interesting. Very.
Fascinating. Okay, well, looking back at from your initial encounter with No Bad Parts, it sounds like you've done work with, this author and you've really, really gone deep. But looking back on your initial encounter with this concept of internal family systems or No Bad Parts or the work that you've done, how have your thoughts and feelings about this book and these concepts evolved over time? Like, are there any themes that continue to resonate with you on a deeper level, or are there any other parts that are sort of like sprinkling up as new insights for you?
I think my core work and attention is really on the self work, right? So as much as I like playing with parts, and sometimes that's a very good avenue for people, especially because it's something they can visualize and they can play with. And I think what's evolved kind of for me over time is you don't necessarily have to unpack all the parts. It's like one tool in a toolbox. Right. But the self piece, that is really, really important. Like
Yes.
Having people touch that part of themselves, having people have an experience with that part of themselves, that's life-changing. It's like once you touch it, you always have this touch point. You always have a memory of what it felt like. And it's so powerful that you can like reach it again, right? You can go back to it again. And then over time it becomes a habit and over time it becomes very developed. But I think that's the real, like my work has definitely evolved to be centered around that and just kind of understanding what that essential self needs, how that essential self operates, how it, how it energizes itself or depletes energy. And so I think that's a lot of my, my attention now.
I'm smiling big because I so buy into that. The self-work is the most beautiful. And you're right about as soon as you do some work to touch the self, you can never forget it. Yeah. It's literally etched in your memory because it's such a powerful connection back to this version of you that's within, obviously, but is something that you're not necessarily showcasing out to everybody at all times. Like there are so many things, there are so many layers in front of the self. And so any access to the self via, you mentioned something about like a life purpose or a mission statement that's internal, that's only for you, that's an avenue of access point to the self. In fact, you said it really beautifully. You said like, is it like an
impulse.
An impulse. That's what you said.
Yeah. And that's like
impulse.
that I developed, working with so many people. I think the first decade of my work, I started to feel like I found this thing because, everybody talks about life purpose and it's this big thing and people get really confused about it and they get really stressed about it.
It is stressful for sure.
They're trying to figure it out. But the thing is, what I kept finding is that inside the impulse has always been there from birth. The impulse is there and it's like a beacon. It's, it's pulsating. And so you don't have to define it. It can be used in 1,000 different ways. It isn't like being a certain job is your purpose or doing a certain thing in the world is your purpose. It's like this impulse is the purpose and it can be crafted into many things. But once you touch it, once you find it, once you label it, you understand it, it really changes everything. And I've done a lot of that work with people. And it's amazing when they kind of are able to grasp that impulse and then just start to tie it in everywhere.
Yeah. And even if they don't, that impulse stays with them.
Yeah.
Even if they decide not to do anything with it, they will never forget it because it's unforgettable work.
That's right. That's right.
This is just so fascinating. Like such an incredible book, incredible ideology. And I just want to say, I'm so grateful that you decided to talk about this book and bring all of your brilliance and let it shine through.
Thanks.
And now I'm even more excited to talk about the feminine and the masculine and all of that. So we've got to get that organized and, that'll be for another episode. But thank you, Sonia, for showing up here, for bringing your brilliance and just sharing with such authenticity and such openness your experience with these concepts and how it's made a difference in your life.
Oh, thank you. It's been an absolute pleasure. I love what you're doing here.
And that's it for this episode of Books That Built Me. If you've enjoyed this episode, please take a moment to leave us a review. It really helps support what we're doing here. Thanks again for listening, and you can always find me on my LinkedIn at Shar Banerjee. That's SHAR Banerjee. If you are dealing with a leadership challenge, I would love to hear from you and have you join our community. And of course, I will talk to you next Tuesday on a brand new episode of Books That Built Me.